So my name is Lauren Kolb. I am currently a postdoc at the University of Maryland. Thank you, this will be helpful. But this presentation is about my research at the University of Maine looking at weed control advances for organic spring cereals. I'm going to try to condense 5 years of research into a 20-minute talk. So this is kind of the highlights of the big overall picture of what we found with all of our work with organic spring barley and organic spring wheat. One of the great things about working with cereals is that, compared to a lot of the other crops, maybe garlic, onion, cereals are super competitive, so they're kind of fun to work with because they kind of help themselves. Spring cereals grow well in cooler temperatures, so if you get your crop out early, you're going to beat a lot of the later emerging summer annuals like your amaranthus species, your lamb's quarters, velvet leaf, those kind of weeds that are really competitive, but they emerge later than your spring cereals would if you get them out early. They also have big seed size, so that puts them at an initial size advantage over a lot of weed species. And they also tiller, so they can form a nice big thick canopy that prevents light from getting to the soil surface and encouraging further regermination. And if you get the canopy to close over those weeds, then it'll totally prevent those weeds from growing and setting seed. And we can see that illustrated in this graph here. We just want to look at what does adding wheat do to mustard seed production. And I mentioned that cereals are at an advantage over many weeds, but mustard is not one of them. They also grow well in those cooler temperatures, and so that's one of the big weed problems we see in the spring cereals. So when we grow mustard by itself, with no competition from wheat, you'll have a tremendous seed range, upwards of 24,000 seeds per meter squared. When you just add wheat, no cultivation, 400 plants per meter squared, which is about 2 bushels per acre, that's pretty common seeding density, we see a 90% reduction in wheat seed production. So wheat is very competitive, and this is good, but it's also not good enough. When those mustards are there, only producing 4,000 seeds, that's still causing a 30% yield loss, a 40% yield loss. Not to mention some of the difficulties you can have harvesting. If they're so green when you go in to take off your crop, you can clog up your combine. Those green bits that end up in the harvested product can cause, spoilage and mold and all sorts of issues. And then also, 4,000 seeds is a lot of seeds to be adding back to the seed bank, especially, if you're trying to rotate cereals with vegetables or, just anything that you have following that cereal. You don't want that many weeds in your next crop either. So ideally, the best thing that you can do for weed management in cereals is to really limit how many weeds you have going into it. So, having proper crop rotations, making sure you're using summer fallow and cover cropping appropriately to really be reducing that weed seed bank. When weeds have established, growers are relying on this instrument here. This is the Springtime Harrow. Janice mentioned this earlier. There's a lot of positives about the Springtime Harrow. It's cheap. It works really fast. And it just basically disrupts that top layer of the soil, and small weeds will desiccate and dry on the soil surface. And if you have those ideal conditions, if you have dry soil, small weeds, you can have upwards of 90% cultivation efficacy, which is really awesome. But if growers were consistently getting those results, I wouldn't be here talking to you today. Frequently, what we find is that, all this precipitation that we get, especially in Maine in the spring, you just cannot get out on time to get those weeds when they are susceptible. And I'm finding in Maryland, too, that growers are having a problem with their fall cereals, getting out there in the fall after you get the crop planted, getting those kind of harrows and control weeds in your fall cereals. And so, even though the mustards, I don't know how well you can see this, but the mustards between this wheat, they're not very big. 2 leaves, 2 true leaves, they're not huge, but they're still just too big to be controlled. And we can see that illustrated in this graph, this picture here. This is from my old advisor, Eric. But on the left, this is too big to be controlled with a tine harrow. And these aren't even that big. This is just, 2 true leaves on this cotyledon here. Where you see this extensive rooting system, and that's really what's preventing them from being uprooted. And on the right here is actually the ideal stage. So that's like, you can't even see those weeds. They've just germinated. They're still below the soil surface, or they've just popped out. That's really the stage that growers can be aiming for to get good control. And so when we see this field here, traditional practices, this is just too old for control. So those weeds are going to remain in the field. competing for sunlight and nutrients and, causing pretty steep yield losses. I think the yields in this field with all that mustard was less than 500 pounds per acre. So pretty low yields, and I don't think the quality is there either.
Lauren, was that the native weed population, or did you see that?
This is actually growers' field, so that's their native weed population. I'll get into them. Thank you for reminding me. I forgot to talk about that. But for our study, we actually had a seed of mustard. So, when we talk about weed control tactics, it's a different perspective. Okay, so we talk about weed control tactics in organic systems. We talk about using multiple tactics, and the foundation of any system is really crop rotation. But there's all these other options, and some of them aren't even. We've seen that they've worked in research. For instance, seed size. This is actually really interesting. Out in Montana, they found that if you grade seed and plant the largest cereal seed versus planting the bulk seed, I don't know what's happening. Okay. They actually found that they have like 30% yield increases and like dramatic decreases in weed pressure just from grading the cereal seed and planting the larger, more vigorous seed. But that's not a commercially available option. And the same with variety. Heather Darby and Ellen Mallory both spoke to differences in variety with regards to protein and Don susceptibility, fusarium susceptibility. We also see differences in variety with regards to weed competitiveness. So both, their ability to yield despite weed pressure and their ability to suppress weeds. And then there's also tactics that just don't work together. Fall seed bed is a wonderful way of reducing weed pressure, but we want to get our cereals out as soon as possible in the spring, so those don't really work together.
What about a fall
Yeah, there's been a lot of research on that, and that does work in the fall. Again, it depends. You're running. What's your previous crop, right? Is that going to be out in the field in time for you to do that fall, like the fall seed bed in the fall, and then also Hessian fly-free date. But if you have that extra 2 weeks, if you can do it, do it. I guess that's a general recommendation.
You have any insight on fertility?
Fertility, I don't have a whole lot to say. I'll talk about this a little bit more. But there's been a lot of research, and I think somebody talked about the compost yesterday. I missed that talk. But how when there's too much nutrients, the weeds really do well. And there's been some research on basically targeting nutrient applications just in the crop row to give that the crop all the nutrients. And then those weeds languish because they can't get to the nutrients, but it's been injected below the soil, below the crop seed. So the crop gets to it first and does much better. So I know ARS in Beltsville has just built a custom no-till poultry litter injector to use in fall cereals and low-till organic systems. So I'll be excited to see what happens when that research comes out. But as far as I know, it's kind of dependent on what nutrient sources you have. So if you have solid manure, really isn't an option. But if you have a liquid manure system with a slurry injector, that would obviously be the way to go. And again, it's an expensive thing, but it's something that's been shown to work really well. So today I'm going to talk about the 2 methods that we focused on in improving weed management and organic cereal production. And the first was just to maintain that initial seed size advantage I was talking about by increasing the competitiveness of the crop relative to the weed, and to keep that going for longer into the season and have it start earlier. And one of the easiest ways to do that is just to simply increase the seeding rate. As I mentioned before, farmers are typically planting 2 bushels per acre. I don't like talking about that. I like talking in strictly numbers. It's more scientific to me. It's easier to compare across studies when you're using populations, like you're doing corn and soybeans. But 2 bushels per acre in barley ends up about 200 plants. And if you increase the population of 500 plants, you can see how much less bare soil this is. This is a much more vigorous crop. The weeds are already touching. You can tell that that's going to form a canopy sooner and just be a lot more competitive with weeds.
500 plants per what?
Meter squared. So,
when does it start to compete among itself?
I'll get to that too. But that's the thing, is finding that balance between competing with weeds and then having too much competition with themselves, and then also what are the appropriate, we have to adjust nutrient recommendations based on our plant populations. And then we also looked at row spacing. In the US, we're planting 6.5 to 7 inches. In Europe, they're using more narrow row spacing. We do that more narrow row spacing, we're reducing the population in row, reducing the in-row crowding, and hopefully, we're distributing the crop more evenly in the field, so hopefully we're competing with weeds sooner. And then the opposite, and the not recommended thing to do would be to go a wider row, right? Because it's going to take longer for that canopy to form, it's going to be a less competitive cropping environment. But when we go to a wider row, we can incorporate inter-row cultivation. And so this is something that they're using more and more in Northern Europe because they're having problems with their time harrowing in the winter cereals, and also problems with quackgrass. So they're using the inter-row cultivator to take care of those things. And they have, the vision guided system, so they don't have the same problems with cultivator blade. And, they can get a pretty big proportion of that inter-row space with these cultivators. And one of the, awesome things about this is you can do it multiple times in a season, and that you can get weeds that you wouldn't even dream of getting with a time cultivator, because, it's undercutting rather than just kind of disturbing soil so those weeds get disrupted. And so we bought Schmatzer cultivator from Germany, and it was human powered, and this was actually, or human steered, I'm sorry. And so this was actually one of the more fun chores on the farm. I don't know if you can see, but everybody in this picture is smiling. So I have a short video of it here. I don't know if you. But it's got those parallel linkages and then the wheels for depth control. So if your field is uneven, you're still maintaining, only going down, 1 inch to 2 inches, so you're not bringing up a lot of new weed seeds. And you have very good control of those weeds in the row. So I have a whole video on this, and I have a link where you can see more of the video at the end. But really fun to drive, really effective, and obviously this is only 10 feet wide, but they make them up to 30 feet wide, so get a scale appropriate one. And I think Heather Darby was mentioning that they're using it for other crops too, so it's not just for cereals. If you're going to narrow corn, you can probably use this too. So lots of options for this. The big question is, are these improvements over what we're currently doing? For pharmaceuticals in the UK, when you develop a new drug, it has to be better than what's on the market. It can't just work. So I feel like that's something that maybe we can learn into our agronomic practices. Okay, yeah, this works, but is it better than what we're doing? Is it better in terms of yield or weed suppression or quality? Is it making a difference in a way that is a tangible benefit to farmers? And so I'm just going to talk about 4 treatments today. We looked at more, but these are the 4 that really, 3 that showed the most promise, and then the 1 that was our farmer standard. So we're looking at spring wheat. This is over 2 years. And we have our farmer standard practice, so 400 plants per meter squared in wheat with about 2 bushels per acre. And we included, time cultivation. And we compared that with a wide row system that was on 9-inch row spacing with the same population over the field. So again, 2 bushels per acre. And then compared those 2 lower density treatments with a narrow row high density treatment. So looking at 600 plants per meter squared, I think that's about 3 bushels per acre on the 4.5 row spacing, and then also looking at the regular row spacing with that high density as well. See, is it the density that's making the difference, or is it the row spacing? So we didn't have wild mustard at our farm. That's not the legacy that I wanted to leave at the University of Maine. So we planted condiment mustard at 8 pounds per acre, so it was 50 plants per meter squared for that uniform, competitive, cool, season growing weed for our research. And one of the neat things that we're able to do, I got a grant from Decagon for a leaf area index meter. So we're able to measure how the canopy developed over the season and compare that between systems, because we know that weeds are very susceptible for competition for light. So if there's differences in the way these canopies are developing, maybe that's going to have implications for weed survival and weed growth. And so we started 37 days after planting. I think that's late tillering until the soft dough stage. And what you'll first notice is that those two high density treatments had the largest, or the greatest canopy early in the season. So this is significantly greater than those 2 lower density treatments, the standard system and our wide row system. And then you'll notice that it stays low in that wide row system. You know, with those wide rows, that canopy maybe isn't touching or it's barely touching. Not a very competitive system. Not very good for controlling weeds unless you have that cultivator. The standard treatment, you'll notice as the season progresses, it catches up to the high density treatment that's standard row. So it's tillering, it's filling in, it just takes a while. And then our narrow high density treatment, we kind of saw something similar to the corn. It just seemed to stay green longer. So we got a greater canopy growth and sustained canopy growth. So while this was starting to dry down, the narrow row system was still going strong. And I didn't measure that, the days to maturity. That would have been something that would have been interesting to do. I'm not really sure why that happened, but I guess that'd be something to look into in the future. So when we look at the mustard results, not too surprising, we see the greatest mustard density in what growers are currently doing. So that's standard farmer practice, the most weeds. So it's good that we saw an effect, right? We know that both increasing crop density and adding that interrow cultivator lowers weed survival. And there wasn't really a difference between the 4.5 inch-row spacing and then 7 inch-row spacing.
So,
I'm sorry, do you want to go back?
and the wide had the schmatzer?
The wide had the schmatzer, so that's why you see the greater mustard mortality. So I think this is 60% lower than our standard system, so pretty big results. When we look at mustard biomass, that was a little bit different. We still have the greatest biomass in our standard farmer practices, but there's no difference between these remaining three. So that means that the weeds that are surviving this wide row system, even though there's less of them, they're getting larger. So it's kind of this trade-off where they're in this less competitive system, the ones that are surviving are getting larger. I don't have a slide on this, but it ends up that the weed seed, actually I do. The weed seed production ends up being equal. So the weeds are larger, but the amount of seed being produced per area is the same. So you don't have to worry about, your weed problem getting worse with a wide row system. When we look at grain yield, this was another one that I thought was a little bit surprising, although maybe it's not. But even though we have greater weed suppression with these high density systems, we have equivalent yield. So even though you're spending that extra money for that extra seed and getting that weed suppression, it's not resulting in a greater yield in these organic systems. We did notice 4/10 of a metric ton per hectare benefit with this wide row system, which is about 6 bushels per acre. So at $15 a bushel, that's a real difference with this wide row system. I don't know, the plants looked great, they looked really healthy, got rid of those weeds, and we saw a yield benefit for it. And finally, we did some partial budgets to determine, well, what does the economics of using these things look like? When I went into this, I thought that this seed would be the way to go, because it seems there's just like such a low input way of controlling the weeds. But it turns out, adding that extra bushel of organic seed, that's at least $30 an acre more. Whereas using that interrow cultivator, that's only $8 an acre. So it's a lot more economical, plus you're getting the yield benefit. So that's about $200 more per hectare than our standard farmer practices, with seed being the big determiner. So if you were saving your own seed, then maybe the way to go is to plant more seed. But if you're buying your seed, then I would recommend this wide row system. And then finally, we also looked at quality, because that's obviously an important determinant when you're talking about bread wheat. 13.5% is what the minimum we like to see in spring wheat. Obviously, we'd like more on 14.5%, 13%. We did have a year by treatment effect. So in 2009, in Maine, it was a very wet, cold year, and so I don't know if there's less end mobilization or more nitrogen leaching, but less grain protein in 2009. In 2010, we did see a pretty significant difference between these systems. Our two systems that had that lower seeding rate had higher grain protein. So there's something going on, maybe some competition, maybe these plants at the lower density are larger, so they're able to mobilize more nutrients during grain fill. There's something going on. But I have to say they all meet the requirements, so it's not like it's a huge depression. But if it's a bad year and you're on that borderline, that might make a difference. And so my advisor said, so what? What does this all mean? How can you extrapolate what you learned in Maine to, what if there's more weeds? What if there's less weeds? And so I did some simulation modeling and to ask those questions, like what happens what's the importance of starting population? So, so I constructed a model. Don't let your eyes gloss over. Mine did too, and I was like, I don't know if I can do this. But anyway, what we looked at is we arranged, looked at seed banks starting from 1,000 to 100,000. And you're like, oh, that's a big range, but we've gone out and tested farms in the Northeast, and that's actually representative of the seed banks that we're seeing on the farms. Okay, and so we ran a model for 10 years using the inputs that we got from this experiment, like weed survival, weed seed production, and looked at the differences between our wide row system, what farmers are using, the standard system, and the narrow row system with the elevated seeding rate. And so this lambda equals 1 means that there's no population growth, okay? So what you start with is what you end with. And what you'll notice is that with our standard system, at all populations, we're having a seed bank growth. So what farmers are doing is just adding to their weed problems on farm by doing what they're currently doing. With our narrow high density system, with starting seed banks less than 7,000 seeds per meter squared, we're seeing a decline in the seed bank. So using that high density is a way of keeping your seed bank low when you're starting with a low seed bank. When you have a high seed bank though, greater than 10,000 seeds per meter squared, which is about double what we saw in the study, the wide row system ends up being the best system for bringing that seed level down, but it's still high. It's not going down that much. And then I wanted to look at the trade-off, so that standard system, 1 year return is better, right? Because you're not spending that money on seed. But how long would it take for that high density seeding to pay off? You're spending an extra $30 an acre in 1 year, but what if you do it multiple years and you're getting a reduction in the seed bank, and then the next year you're having less weeds, and then you're going to have a yield reduction due to weeds. And so we started with 5,000 seeds in the seed bank and ran the model for 20 years. And you see over time, the narrow high density system, we're starting to go down to 0. The wide system is starting to go down. It's pretty much staying the same. And then we're seeing a pretty drastic increase with our standard farmer practices. But it takes 8 years for that high density seeding rate to pay off. So it seems like a long-term investment, but if you're just a starting farmer, maybe that's worth it for you. Or if you're selling your farm, you can just, let the weeds go. And then another 10 years to 18 years to pay off with the wide row system. So to summarize all these different things that we looked at, row spacing, it doesn't hurt. We talk about many little hammers. Some hammers can be very tiny. So row spacing is a very tiny hammer. Some years it might be more important than others. It doesn't hurt, but it's not a big impact. Plant spatial arrangement, I didn't really talk about this, but I didn't show the data from this, but broadcasting your seed to get a more even distribution or doing 2 different passes doesn't really pay off. You're not getting a big impact on weeds. If you're broadcasting your seed, you're spending a lot of money just throwing your seed away. Lower emergence, they're more susceptible to be uprooted during time harrowing. We just did not find the benefit. And plant population, obviously a dramatic effect on weed growth, but we're balancing that organic seed cost. And then finally, their intro cultivator, dramatic effect on weed growth, definitely cheaper than adding more seed. And then, does it fit in your farm plan? If you have a lot of other things going on, you should be cultivating your wheat. Is that going to work? And so, obviously, also depending on weed severity. If you don't have a lot of weeds, you don't need an intro cultivator. So, some future research, I was thinking about this. Now that I work with vegetables, I miss cereals. But I know Canada's been doing a lot of research on frost seeding, and that's not necessarily amenable to organic systems because of fungal. But I was thinking maybe, what if we do all our prep in the fall and we get a tillage radish in there and that dies over the winter, and then we can go in the first thing in the spring and plant our cereals without having to do the primary and secondary tillage. That way we get your crop in early. The tillage radish is scavenging all the nitrogen. It might be a good situation for growers. The precision nutrient applications, I mentioned this earlier, that also I think we need to start thinking about getting those things, at least on our research farms, if not on farms. So, make sure that we're giving all the nutrients to our crop and not to our weeds. And then finally, more appropriate seeding rate recommendations and nutrient recommendations for weedy conditions. Adding 50% more seed, maybe this doesn't make sense, but maybe 25% more seed would provide those weed benefits without necessarily the big drag in net returns. So, the whole entire video is on this Weed Ecology YouTube website, so I encourage you to check that out. We have the video on the cultivator, and then also on some scale-appropriate technology for vegetable growers. And then the Northern New England Local Red Wheat Project is also an excellent site for people in the Northeast region wanting to grow red wheat. And then you can also email me if you can't see these links and you want more information. So I'd just like to thank field staff for all their field stuff. They've been wonderful. And then, funding from USDA, the OREI, the PSU Department of the University of Maine, Definitely on Devices, allowed me to do this research. So, if anybody has any questions for Kurzberg, and I saw him, you can thank him too.
Thank you, Lauren.
Yes.
What was the plant population density that you were shooting for in the wide roads tonight?
Can you repeat the question?
I'm sorry. What was the plant density I was aiming for in the wide row system?
Yeah,
It was 400 plants per meter squared. So
per acre.
per acre, I couldn't give you a plant population off the top of my head. I know it worked out to about
Brian's going to calculate.
180 pounds of wheat seed per acre, and the germination rate on that was pretty high. I can email you the plant population. I can figure it out. I just don't have it in my head.
What was the growth spacing on that?
But 9 inches. People want to go a little bit tighter than that. From driving that, I think 9 inches is the way to go, just in case there's like a rock or something. You can steer around it. Yes.
When you do the economics of that, do you consider, like in the wide road system, the depreciation of that? See, I mean, that thing didn't look like something they were finding in the hedge road.
No, it doesn't. We use data from the USDA's National Ag Statistics Service, so that all that data had the depreciation costs and the ownership costs built in, and so they give you a per acre or per unit hour of operations. So that was the only fair way that we could compare those different systems.
Just to follow on that, how fast does that unit go? How long does it take to do an acre with that?
So you can do 6 miles per hour. So depending on your width, how long it would take.
It seemed like a low number to me. You have 2 operators that needed.
You do have 2 operators, so that's if you're on a small scale farm, yeah. But if you have 30-foot one, and it's vision guided, different story. But I mean, they were talking yesterday about putting them into vegetable operations. To prevent that weed seed rain in the wheat crop for your next vegetable crop, maybe that's worth it. And I think Heather got a better deal. She paid less than half that we did. She paid $4,000 for that for Germany, and I think ours was, the euro was really high. It was over 10,000. It was a bad scene, but and we paid VAT tax. I don't know how you guys got around that, but yes.
One of your early slides, you had all these different variables affecting weed pressure, and crop rotation was one.
Mm-hmm.
But did you look at, or are you looking at crop rotation effects and impact on weed seed bank, future pressure?
We did not look at that. I think the emphasis was just on that in-season stuff. But obviously that's important, and rotating your spring annual crops with your winter annual crops. I think that's very important. But I don't think there was any way to test a rotation effect and then do all this research too. But that's definitely an important thing. What is this weed following? If it's following something that's you can cultivate and do a good job of keep it clean, you don't have that weed, that fresh weed from last year.
Yeah, or if it's following a legume forage that's been grazed or mowed
Mm-hmm.
and eliminate any weed seed development, that really can impact having a clean field to plant.
Oh yeah, and that's why we try to look at the importance of the initial seed bank for what it is. It just happens to work out that standard system is competitive, but just not competitive enough against that mustard, that northern seed, getting really large northern seed in that system. Even when it's smaller densities, you're still getting big plants that are setting water seed. And, if you have a different weed that's less competitive or less, less, what's the word, fecund? Is that a word? Less able to put out a lot of weed seed at once. Yeah, you have differences in weeds, like in terms of weed output. If you have weeds like that don't put out, 10,000 seeds per plant, then it's a different story. So obviously very dependent on your weed pressure and then also the weed community itself. Yes.
How do you actually measure the seed? What do you call the seed rate? Because you had a number there for how many seeds were
you go out in the field and you cut all your weeds, and then you thresh them, and then you count them.
Oh, you cut them before they shatter.
Yeah, so before they shatter. But we got a seed counter, so that helped things a lot. Because the first year we counted by hand.
But you assume 100% maturity of everything. That you assume that they'll.
Yeah, but in our model, we then put in what's it called? You know, we have an overwinter mortality factor based on the literature that determines how much dies based on where it is in the soil layer.
Makes you want to go back to graduate school.
Yeah.
That was a low time in my life.
I thought maybe you put sheets on the ground.